guest today is a special one. Board certified in emergency medicine and preventive medicine, he is a federally funded researcher and teacher. He is the principal investigator on over $6 million funded federal research and training grants. He and his teams have trained approximately 900 physicians from Egypt and multiple other countries in the Middle East in emergency care-related topics. He has been the author of over 80 articles and chapters on various topics, helping place emergency care on the global health agenda. He has held leadership positions in many organizations, prominently including the American College of Emergency Physicians, where he was chairman of the Public Health Committee, president of its Maryland chapter, and governing counselor. He has been honored by his peers and the American College of Emergency Physicians as a hero of emergency medicine. He has also honored us by his membership in Amsterdam's International Advisory Group and by taking the time to be among us today. All the way from Maryland University, please help me welcome Dr. John Mark Harrison.
Shukran. Sabah khair. So I'm here today to talk a little bit. First of all, let me ask a question. If I don't use the microphone, can you hear me? Is that okay? Everyone in the back? Okay. No? Okay. Then I'll use the microphone. Okay, then I can walk around. I'm not very good. Being a good emergency physician, I'm not very good at standing still. I'm always walking around. So it's nice if I can get up and walk around a little bit. Let me get myself all set up, and I'll get started. Okay, so I'm here today to talk about a couple of topics. The first thing I want to talk about right now is, first of all, I want to say thank you. Okay? I want to say thank you to my colleagues at Shams for the attendance from Cairo University and for others. And most importantly, I want to thank you as students for coming, because you're our future, and it's important that we help you to learn how to do a better job, because we've had enough years to cause all the trouble we have, so it's at some point it will be your job to try to make it all better, inshallah. So I'm going to talk today, to start off with, by talking about putting together a winning research proposal. Okay? How many of you have to write project proposals? How many? How many of you are probably going to have to write project proposals in the future? Okay. So if I can help you at least introduce the idea right now about how to do a good job, inshallah, it will help you in the future. Okay. So in the U.S.,
actually, I just need to have a comment. Actually, we need to hear this. We need to get this lecture for everybody at Shams University, not only for students.
but the students are our future, so I'll start with them. Because as a professor, I don't listen very well anymore. But yes, inshallah, this is a lecture for everybody. All right, in the U.S., when we do a lecture nowadays, we have to give our disclosures. What's a disclosure? It's to say who's giving me money. Why is that important? Well, if I'm telling you about medications and the drug company's giving me money, it's good for you to know. My disclosures are that I've been fortunate, alhamdulillah, with my colleagues to get funded to do work by the U.S. government here in the Middle East. I'm also got funding from other sources in the U.S., but none of them are drug companies. And then I'm now on as a board member of the American College of Emergency Physicians. So I just want to make sure you know where I'm coming from and kind of my background. Okay. So in addition to that, I want to just note a little bit about my background is that I've been teaching and working with students for a long time. I've got enough gray hair to show that I've been doing it for a while. Okay? But most importantly, I've been spending a lot of time mentoring students about how to write projects and mentoring junior faculty. And in a way, I put this lecture together because over the years I've had many people come to me and ask, I've got a great idea. I want to do research. And I'm like, okay, great. Alhamdulillah. Now, how do you want to do that? Okay, so let's take a step back a little bit and say, how do you put together a proposal? Okay? So the reason this is an important lecture are twofold. The first is that here in Egypt, and it's not just Egypt, but we need to get better data. In fact, when I first started coming here over 10 years ago, a colleague from Cairo University told me the hardest thing to do here in Egypt is to get good data. Okay? So it is not easy, but it's important. So it's important so that we can improve the care we give our patients. It's important so that we can develop good projects to improve the care and to help in terms of funding. And the reason it's important to be able to write a good proposal is you need clarity of thought. You have to be clear. The people who are going to be reading your proposal have to understand what you're doing and why it's important. It has to be clear, concise, and organized. Okay? So I put together a whole sheet which I can share with the medical students. I'll email it to Dr. Mohammed or somebody else. A whole sheet in terms of what I'm going to talk about in the lecture today. But as I said, I've had students come to me in young junior faculty over many years, and this is why I put this together. I like to say it was because of self-defense. I had to protect myself from all the questions, but to be honest, it's because I want to help people to do a better job. So when you start, what's the first thing you see in a proposal? The title, right? So you want the title to be clear. You want the title to tell the people that are reading your proposal what it's about and why. So it should be clear, concise, indicate the purpose of the project, and potentially, if possible, indicate the time frame of when the project is going to be done or was done. So when you look at papers in manuscripts and journals, critique their title. How good is that title? Does that title tell you what you need to know? That's what the titles are about. And some examples, okay? Now, some of these are good titles, some of them are published titles, some of them are not so good titles, okay? And simply because they're published doesn't mean it's a good title, just to let you know. So, factors that lead to increased spending and interpersonal violence in Egypt. Is that a good title? I'm up here for a while. If I ask you guys a question, someone's going to ask, because I'll just stand here for quite a while.
Did someone answer?
So until someone answers. Is this a good title? Why? It's not concise.
Yes.
What else? Why is this not a good title?
Time.
There's no time frame. What else? What? So, what's factors? What's interpersonal violence? How do you define that? Is that violence between people who are married? Is it violence against children? Is it Mishai? I don't know. Egypt. Egypt's a small place, right? Only 80 million people. 85 million people. So, it sounds like an interesting topic, but it lacks detail. It's not quite clear enough because it's not precise enough. So this is one of the ones I like to show because it's a good idea. People come to me with good ideas, but we have to hammer it together to make it better. What about this one? Young Egyptians' perceptions, attitudes, and knowledge of injuries. What's the topic? What?
Which type of injuries?
What type of injuries? But what's the topic? Perception. Okay. And young Egyptians, I'm not sure, does that mean someone who's 10 or someone who's 30? Teenagers, young adults, okay? This is a knowledge, attitude, and practice type of survey. This is published, by the way. This is one of ours. It actually is a pretty good paper. It doesn't give dates, it doesn't give times. It gives you a kind of general topic. But I hope, even though it may not be the best title, it makes you interested enough to go look at the paper perhaps. That's part of what a title needs to do. Unscheduled revisits in medical emergency units at Alpha Hospital. incidence and related factors. How many of you are thinking of doing surgery or emergency medicine? Couple. Okay. So is the medical emergency unit an important place? Because I think so, because that's what I do. So that's so. But how good is this title? How good is this title?
Good.
It's a good title, huh? Okay, that's one opinion. Anybody else? Go ahead. Why?
Doesn't specify the exact factor, no time.
When so if I told you the study was from, this doesn't tell me, was it the study done in 1900 or 2000? Does that make a difference?
Yes.
What hospital? Bishai? What else? What else about this can we try to improve? Yes. Factors. Okay. We'll talk about a little bit about variables, about exposure and outcomes, just a little bit. Okay. But I don't know what a related factor is. I want a little bit more. I need more information. How about this one? Ambulance versus private and public transport of trauma patients at Ain Shams University Hospital, Cairo. Effect on outcome. Good? Not good?
Define outcome.
Okay, so we don't know what outcome is. Though often when you talk about outcome here, it would be admission, discharge, death. Those are, but you may not know. So that may be better. You may need to define that. Do you know Ain Shams University Hospitals? Is that clear? Ambulance versus private trauma patients. Okay. What's a trauma patient? Maybe we should say major trauma patients. You know, we're not sure. It's you know the patient population, but again, it could be clearer. Now, you can't put everything into a title. Part of the job of the title is to make you interested in reading the paper. Okay, so you have to leave a little bit not there, but you want it to be pretty clear. And last but not least, Clostridial difficile infection in outpatients, Maryland and Connecticut, USA, 2002 to 2007. What's the disease process? What's the disease process? Infection, Clostridium difficile specifically. Where is it located? In outpatients. In Maryland and Connecticut, and there's a time frame. And that was one of our other published papers. But the idea here is that, as you can see, the title is important. The title is going to pull you into the story. So it's important that you think about how you want to do the title. Okay? It doesn't have to have everything. Titles tend to be very short. But you want it to be clear, concise, and be detailed. So, what's the next part after a title? What's the next part after a title? Thank you. So it should be 1 or 2 paragraphs. What's the purpose of the introduction? Background. What else?
Significance. Significance.
Address the problem. So when I put together my introduction, it does a couple things. First of all, it says, how important is the topic? Is the topic important? If it's not important, then why am I working on it? Okay. So first is, this is an important topic. Okay.
Actually, I have a question.
Sure.
Actually, yes. The second part after the title is the introduction. But do I have to write it after I define my title, or I have to wait for writing the introduction till I get to the conclusion?
That's a good question. So let me repeat the question, actually I should put this in the lecture as well. How do you put together the proposal? So what parts come first? Okay. So in general, what I work on are the research question or hypothesis, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and then the introduction. Okay? So the introduction to me helps me frame my question. So it's not the first thing, but it's one of the first things I put. One of the first things. The title is usually last. Okay? But it's what somebody else is going to read first. Good question. And please, you don't have to be up here to ask me questions. So if you have questions, please ask me questions. Okay? So in my introduction, I explain what is known. I highlight what is not known. Okay. What's the purpose of research? The research is to develop new knowledge. So if I'm not saying that there's a gap in knowledge, alas, why do I need to do research? Okay. If there's not a problem, then what's the purpose of the project? Okay. I should show the gap in the knowledge that my project will answer. Okay. And this should set up my researcher goal and my primary hypothesis. Okay. So for me, this is a very standard formula. The first sentence tends to be, this is an important topic because. I don't say that in every one of my proposals, but essentially that's what the first one is going to cover. Second question, this is what we know about the topic. Okay, this is what we know. The third question, the third sentence is, this is what we don't know. This is the gap. And the last part is, this is how my research, my project, my activity is going to answer the gap. Now, let me be clear about one thing. I'm talking about research, okay? But this methodology, this perspective, generally is going to be important. Now, whatever project, this may not go up to the President Housing Training Principal at Howard University, and I'm asking for something. The hypothesis is a very specific component. The research question is my general hypothesis. Why is this important? What's my overall? Why do you need to do the process? Not how what is my project going to answer the problem you just told me. What's my overall? What am I trying to? That kind of clear. What I'm trying to accomplish with our project here for you when you want to do a project, whether it's research or something else, the morbidity and mortality from injury. So after I've set up my kind of project, I may have very specific proposals or hypotheses, but that's my overall research project. Okay? What's the main thing that's going to be taken away? What's the main thing takeaway of the point? You want to identify this. You want to make sure that you kind of identify the broad area of research, and it really should be a question, phrased as a question. So some samples are, what is the impact of anticoagulants, like warfarin, for example, or the new ones, on elderly trauma patients? I'm not asking a specific hypothesis. I'm asking, what's the general impact? And then my hypothesis may be very detailed within that question. How does the utility of online medical consult impact helicopter usage for trauma? So, without context, it's hard to know. In Maryland, we use helicopters to go to the scene of crashes, many crashes, and pick up patients to bring them back to the hospital. We have a lot more resources, a lot more helicopters in Maryland. But the question is, how do we use those resources best? So, if you have a doctor that they have to talk to before they bring a patient, how does that impact the utilization of the So it's not a specific hypothesis, but it's the general research topic. Or we did a project in which in the US you usually write a prescription for somebody and then they get discharged. But we asked, what happens is instead of giving them a prescription, we gave them medications. So we gave them antibiotics for their infection. Okay? How does that impact? What's the impact on the patients coming back? That was our general research question. The hypothesis is slightly different, but for the research question, it gives you the general topic. Now I'm going to stop for a second and ask, just to be clear, am I talking too fast? Are you guys, is everything okay? Okay, I just want to make sure. Sometimes I get very excited and I start talking like this, you want to move me down. Okay, so I've introduced you to the idea with I've excited you with my title. I've introduced the topic and told you what we're going to do. I've given the general topic, and now we'll get down to the very specific hypothesis. A hypothesis is a clear, testable statement. I do research. My job is to, I'm just trying to find out answers to questions, okay? I'm trying to be able to say yes or no to something. I have to be able to test it. That's what I do, okay? So it has to be clear, concise to the point. It has to be very specific, okay? I'm testing something, it has to be specific. One of the problems I see with many young researchers is that, and I'm the same way, it was the same way as, I want to do this, but you have to start with this. Okay? If you can answer this, then maybe the next time you can answer this and this. We all, I don't know about you, but I went into medicine and into emergency medicine because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to do something, but you realize after a while that you can make differences in small ways and big ways, but to get to the big ways, you have to start with the small ways. Okay? You don't get to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro in a single step, one step at a time. So, you want to identify specific relationships between the variables. Okay, I'm going to be very clear. This is a critically important part of what you do. Okay, if you're doing a research proposal, if you're doing a project for somebody, they're going to say, what exactly are you going to be doing? So let's look at some specific hypotheses. Again, let's see how they are. Okay, so the first one, shock index is the best predictor of blood product usage. Good, not good, how would you make it better? Raise your hand or speak out loudly. If you can speak loudly, I can hear you. Go ahead. All right, so there's no comparison. It says best predictor compared to what? To the doctor saying yes, no? Now, let me just let you know, shock index is a very specific calculation, so that has a specific definition. So my exposure is clear, but it doesn't show what I'm comparing it to. What else? What type of blood product? Are there different types of blood product? Red blood cells, FFP, platelets? I don't know. So, it's a nice idea, maybe more of a research question. It's not a clear hypothesis, not testable, or easily testable. Poor discharge instructions lead to the increased unplanned ED revisits within 7 days at Nasser City Hospital in Cairo, Egypt. How's that?
Goes without saying. No need for research.
It goes without saying. Many of the things that we study in research go without saying, but when you study them, you realize that there's a lot more to know than not. So yes, I agree. We know that this is, but we have to prove it. That's why I'm a scientist. But, okay. There's a lot we can talk about this. But so what do you think of this? What do you think of this as a hypothesis, though? Aside from the topic, what do you think of the hypothesis? Go ahead. Okay, so we don't know what type of patients. That's a good question. Part of what I'll often do in my hypothesis is define my population. So this doesn't define the population very well. What else? When? Does it make a difference if this was in 1990 versus 2012? All right. What else? Do you know where it's happening? Do you know that location? So that's pretty clear. What's an unplanned ED revisit? I may not be able to answer all of that in my hypothesis, but in something like that where I have to define it, there's usually a paragraph underneath my hypothesis that supports my hypothesis. So if I have specific terms I need to define, I'll probably not put that in my hypothesis, but I will define them shortly thereafter. Okay? But it's not bad. Even though we know, of course, it would. That would make a difference. Trauma patients admitted to shock trauma center on dabigatran, which is a type of anticoagulant, have an increased incidence of bleeding complications compared to the general trauma population. So remember we talked about that research question which was about anticoagulants in the elderly? So this is this is the hypothesis that might go along with that research question. Okay? So trauma patients, we can define major or minor, but we at least know the population. Shock trauma center is a specific location. Okay? We have the exposure, which is that bigatron, which is an anticoagulant. We have increase, so we have direction, and then we have bleeding complications. That may be a little, we may have to define that a little bit better. And then we have a comparison group, general trauma population, which we probably have to define a little bit better. Okay. But now you can see when I read a hypothesis, this is, regardless of the hypothesis, this is what I do. To me, a hypothesis is almost like a formula. This is one of my slides. Oh, there it is. I think I was by it before. Okay, so my hypothesis is almost like a formula. Factor X impacts outcome Y in a specific direction. So it's almost like X leads to Y, in this instance, as an increase. Okay? When I look at a hypothesis, I try to break it down to that formula. There may be a lot of other things in that formula. There may be what are called confounders, other variables, etc. But in the end, X impacts Y. I want to be able to understand that in my hypothesis. If I do a proposal for the president of Einstein University, they're going to ask, what's my outcome? If I give you the funding for this, what's your outcome? Yes?
This doesn't apply for preference studies though.
Good point. So when we're talking about, this is hypothesis-driven research. So sometimes, I'll go back to what I said, the reason we do research is because we simply don't have the data. Sometimes your study is simply to get basic data, such as a prevalence study. Now you can still make predictors in many prevalence studies. You can say that we predict that factor X is going to be associated with outcome Y. But if you have no knowledge, no data, sometimes all you have to do as your first step is get the data. So there are times in a project or proposal, particularly early on, in which you're only going to get baseline data. So you may not be able to do a hypothesis. So we started with the title, I pulled you in. I gave you an introduction to give you the background to understand what was going on and why. We talked about the general topic, and I gave you the specific hypothesis that we're interested in. Now, what's going to happen? What's my outcome? The primary outcome should be defined by the hypothesis. That's what you're looking at. When you look at X leads to Y, that primary outcome, that Y is my outcome. But it doesn't mean that there are not important secondary outcomes. And often when you look at major studies, their primary outcome they may not have been able to achieve, but they get important secondary outcomes. Okay? And that will depend on the topic and the questions and what other variables you've included. Okay? The other thing that happens sometimes with the secondary outcomes is that they lead to new questions. So when you start out a research career, not just a research project, you start with your research question, your research topic, and every time you answer a new question, it's like a book. You go to the next page. There's more questions than you want to ask. It is very rare that a single, even a well-done, well-funded study answers all the questions. So, after everything, one of the other important components to consider is who are we studying? And we talked a little bit about this in terms of the hypotheses. Okay? Because does it make a difference who the study population is? If I'm looking at trauma patients in a 5-year-old or a 75-year-old, how they respond to trauma is going to be very different. So, my test population will impact what's called generalizability. What do I mean by that? Well, when I do research, I want to be able to say how that research applies to other places. Okay? So if I'm looking at trauma patients at Einstein University, can I apply that to Castle? Okay, can I apply that to a different hospital? I would think so. But if I'm looking at children, I may not be apply that to adults or elderly. So part of my definition of the test population impacts how well I can compare it to other groups. It has to be very specific. The test population has inclusion-exclusion criteria. If I'm doing a project, you want to know where the project is. Where is it going to impact? Who is it going to affect? Okay. Now, in many instances, we can't do the whole population. We do a sample of the population. And sampling is a whole separate lecture. We can talk all about just sampling alone. Okay? And I've got colleagues here who would be happy to talk to you about that. Okay? But it's important to understand how the sampling is done because that impacts how well you can define or talk about the population. Okay? And again, that's a whole separate topic. Now, some of the people here are fortunate enough to have been part of our injury epidemiology course and our online course. And we gave them a quiz the other day. And my ears are still burning from all the feedback we got. But it was good feedback. And one of the questions they asked is, I asked them, here's a problem, how would you solve it? So choosing the study methods, how do you define the study methods? Which ones do you choose? They're very good questions. It depends on the project and depends on the topic. But there are very specific study methodology questions or study methodologies that you can do. So it could be an observational interventional study. So let me go through this very quickly, and then I'll be finishing up after this in a moment. So when you talk about epidemiological study designs, there's really two styles. There's an interventional style and an observational style. What's the difference? In the intervention, I'm doing something to the population. Okay? Randomized controlled trials. What's a randomized controlled trial? Question for you. Someone raise their hand, someone speak up. I can't hear you. What's a randomized controlled trial? Go ahead.
It's kind of study that the researcher play active role in selection of patient, individual by randomization method, and by masking the role of participant and researcher. Don't know what's kind of intervention to be applied on each type of patient or physical.
So there were a couple things she said that I'll reinforce. So first of all, it's randomized. Okay, randomized does not mean convenience. There's a specific methodology that says each person has an equal chance of going into one group or another. And the other part of it as a clinical trial is that I'm doing an experiment. So I'm giving the exposure or intervention to one group versus another. Okay? So it's a randomized clinical trial. But there are a number of reasons why these are considered such strong trial designs, but that's an intervention. I'm experimenting on people. Now, in injuries, it's kind of hard to experiment on people. You can't break one person's leg and not break another person's leg. It doesn't quite work that way. So we don't do a lot of randomized clinical trials in terms of injury epidemiology. So randomized control trials are one, and there are other experimental studies as well. Under observational studies, there's a whole series, and we'll go over this very quickly just so that I can define the terms. Okay? Case series, ecologic studies, cross-sectional, case control, and cohort. Okay? So let me ask, what's a case series?
Multiple case reports.
Multiple case reports. Okay, case series is multiple case reports. That's not a bad definition. What's good about a case series? Go ahead.
It's covered rare diseases.
What?
It's covered rare diseases.
It covers?
It's covered rare diseases.
It can cover rare diseases. Okay, so it can be used for rare diseases. Okay. Anything else about a case series? What does a case series not have? It doesn't have a comparison group. Okay. So I love my colleague, my friend Dr. Muhammad is a surgeon, so I love picking on surgeons. So if you've got one case, it's a case report. It's for surgeons. It's my experience. Okay. If you've got 2 or more cases, it's a case series. It's my vast experience. Okay. So in this instance, the problem with, let's say that I'm an orthopedic surgeon, okay, and I do hip surgeries, and I have a new technique to help with the hip surgeries, okay, and I tell you that 80% of my patients are able to walk with my new procedure after 2 weeks. Is that good? Why? Why 80% can walk after 2 weeks? Isn't that good? What? So maybe the standard is that after 2 weeks, 90% can walk. I don't know. So for a case series is a good way to come up with questions. It doesn't provide you answers as a general rule. They can be very important. So for example, case series, the first publication about HIV infection was about a case series of 3 patients in Los Angeles in 1980 who got acquired immune deficiency. It was a very important start of a whole conversation, but it doesn't answer the question. Okay? It's good for hypothesis generation. All studies have the disease or exposure, but most importantly, there's no comparison. The second type of study that you can do, and these are kind of a pyramid, so these are the easier studies, and they often have less value because you can't really answer questions. An ecologic study is looking at large populations, or it looks at large databases, okay? So it's, the unit of analysis here is population or group rather than individuals. Okay? So it's often used for hypothesis generation, and it uses existing data. They can be very helpful to start conversations again, okay? But one of the problems is what's called the ecologic fallacy is as follows. I can say that the incidence of breast cancer in a country increased with increased or decreased breastfeeding. Okay? So that maybe there's a relationship between breastfeeding and breast cancer. But what I don't know, if I'm looking just at the larger unit, is I can't tell you if the people who are getting breast cancer are the ones that were not doing breastfeeding, because I don't have that level of analysis. So you have to be a little cautious with large databases if they're not the individual, because the assumption here is that the data of the population is the same for the individual, and you have to be very cautious with that. But again, I'm not trying to answer a question, a hypothesis. I'm trying to generate questions to do future research. So they're very important studies. Okay. Now, as was asked earlier, cross-sectional. Cross-sectional rarely, again, answers a question, but it can help you get baseline information. And as we know, as we've said, baseline information here in Egypt, and let me tell you a secret, everywhere, not just here in Egypt. Getting baseline information can be very difficult. Okay? So a survey is a cross-sectional methodology in which we're asking a series of questions at a specific point in time. It gives us a lot of information, and we can publish it. I've published a number of surveys over the years. But that's baseline information. What you can then do is take that to try to answer a question, perhaps with a case control study. Again, if you haven't been introduced to this, you're not going to remember these, but this is an introduction. Okay? What are cases? Are cases. And people without this disease are controlled. And I'm going to take a look and compare those two. Okay? So what happens is I've got people with disease and people without disease, disease-free. And I go back in time and I'm going to see some of the people with disease had exposure. Some of the people with disease did not have exposure. Okay? And here I've got disease-free, some with exposure, and some without exposure. And the idea here is I'm going to try to see if there's a relationship between exposure and disease. There's some real advantages to case control studies. For example, you can look at multiple exposures. You can look at rare diseases. Someone else had mentioned that earlier. So case control studies can be very helpful. There are a lot of risks and pitfalls with case control studies, which are beyond what I want to get into right now. But again, this when I do research, how am I going to answer the question in front of me? How am I going to, I've got a problem, I'm trying to solve the problem. Or someone comes to me with a great idea, and the question is, how are we going to get that idea focused and answer the question? Beshi? The last study design I want to mention very briefly are called cohort studies. Now, with a cohort study, what's different than a case control? With a case control, you start with people with disease and you work backwards. Okay? With a cohort study, you start with people who are exposed and you work to see who gets disease. Okay, so exposed, disease-free, unexposed, disease-free. They don't have disease. And then over time you see, did the people with exposure get more diseases, or did people with exposure not get disease? People unexposed get disease, and those not exposed not get disease. Okay, go ahead.
What's the difference between cohort studies and ecological studies?
In this instance, the question is, what's the difference between, say, this study and ecologic study? In this instance, I'm studying individuals. I have the information on specific patients or specific subjects and can follow them over time. If I'm doing an ecologic study, I just have the analysis for the whole group, but not at the individual level. Okay? So the difference is kind of the level of analysis. It's a good question. If you ask me, a randomized controlled trial is a type of cohort study. Okay? Because I've got individuals who are exposed and unexposed. But the difference is that I control the exposure. And that's why but in a way, it's a special type of a cohort study. It fits within the framework. Okay. So we started with the title. We had your introduction. I've got you excited about the topic. We've thought about what we're going to study. So we're ready to do the research, right? Right? Who's going to collect the data? I'll go back to a non-research question. I go back to the president of my university and I say, I want money for this. He's going to say, great. Good. How are we going to, who's going to get the information? Yes. Okay. Shukran. It gives me a moment to get some water.
Yeah.
So let me work a little bit. We'll get through this and finish up because I'm getting close to the end of my presentation. So you need to be able to collect the data. How are you going to collect the data? Where's the data going to reside? What type of database? These are all things that you have to think about before you do the research. Okay? Even if you're doing paper-based research, if you're doing, on paper, you're going to have to put it into a database. How are you going to get it into the database? These are all things that you want to think about in advance. Okay? The next part is the analysis part. Before I do my research, I have to think about how I'm going to analyze the data. What are the variables I'm collecting? How do they relate to each other? So earlier the question was, when do we write the introduction? Well, when I write a proposal, even before I've collected the data, I have a data analysis plan. Now, does that mean I do exactly what's in my data analysis plan? No. In general, as I get the data, things change a little bit, but this should give me the structure of what I plan to do with the data. It should give me an understanding of what I'm going to do. And let me be clear about one important point here, okay? Before I collect the data, I should be, if I have questions, if I'm not sure, I should get advice at that point, okay? Statisticians are happy to help you, but if you go to them and you ask them to fix a problem that's not fixable, alas, they're not going to be able to do it. there are some errors that you can, or some data issues that you can address with analysis. But if you didn't collect the right data on the right people, the statistician can't create data out of thin air. So it's important to know in advance that it's better to get the help of a statistician or an epidemiologist before you start the research, as opposed to after you've collected the data. Last, there's some other components to talk about as you consider putting together a proposal. Where are you going to do the research? Okay? Who's going to be involved? How much is the research going to cost? All those things are things to consider. Okay? Do you have to get ethical review and approval? How long is the study going to take? What are some milestones, the additional steps and comments? Now, I've gone through these very quickly, but I want to show you an example of, you talk about milestones. There are things called Gantt charts, which kind of give you specific details. So this is a Gantt chart for one of the projects that we did. Okay? To show you the complexity. Each of these is an area, each of these is an activity. This is the people or persons responsible. These are the months that is going to be done. This is when the activity occurred. So you can see in our proposal, this is in the proposal now, this is the level of detail that we had to go through. Okay. Now, do you have to do that as a student? No. But do you have to understand what your milestones are? What's the next important steps? Yes. And you should be able to articulate that. You should be able to write that down and be very clear about it. So let me just finish up a little bit. One of the things I didn't mention, but I'm going to mention now, is that research is a team. Okay? You may be the team lead. You may be the principal investigator. Okay? But it's a team activity. Okay? I was lucky enough 10 years ago to get funded from NIH with collaborators here in Egypt to be able to do the project. But my success is your success. Their success, we've worked together as a team. It's not just one person. I may be the person up here behind the mic and talking to you, but it's really a team effort. Okay? Get that team. Part of you as a leader have to build the team. That's a really important skill, a whole separate conversation. But what you have to do as a researcher is to be able to build your team. Okay? Planning is key. The whole discussion today, this whole lecture, is about being organized, about being clear, about thinking ahead, so that at the last minute you don't have to be changing things and running around. Okay? Communication, communication, communication. For every lecture that we give, we have multiple, when we're doing it as a course, we have multiple discussions, both before and afterwards, about how to do it better. Okay? And last but not least, no matter how much you put into your project time, it always takes longer. So when a student comes to me and says, I have this project, I think it's going to take 3 months, I say, double it. Okay? And if there's funding related to it, I'll often have them 2.5 or 3 times. We're optimistic people. We think we can get it done quicker than it does. If you get it done quicker, great. Then you have a little extra time. But it's better to under-promise and over-deliver than the other way around. So in conclusion, I'm going to say, if you want to go far, if you want to go fast, go alone. Okay? But if you want to go far, go together. So the key here, and the whole purpose today, is really to be clear about a couple things. First of all, you have the ability to change things. Okay? You have the ability with thought and hard work to make a difference. But you have to be clear. You have to be able to get your point. You have to convince other people. So you can work together to build your team and work together to make a difference for your patients and for Egypt. But with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I very much appreciate your attention. Thank you. I swear. Any questions? I swear.
Just a moment. Case series, I think it doesn't need statistical analysis. Cannot make
Yeah.
Yes?
I would agree with that. I think that you could use some. the statement was for a case series, you really don't need statistical analysis. You can use some basic descriptions. Right, but you can't do any, there's no comparison group. And in most statistical analysis, you need a comparison group. I'm a firm believer that meetings should start on time and if possible end early. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on my next presentation. I've got two short presentations to give. One is going to talk about the work that we've been doing here in Egypt and the Middle East, and the other is to talk a little bit about emergency medicine in the United States. And for those who are doing emergency medicine here, the second one is very nice to see where we've come from, but also to give students a sense of where you can go as well. So, what I'm going to do right now is talk a little bit about our program and the development of trauma care globally, but specifically about our acute care research and training here in Egypt and the Middle East. As I said before, what I'm going to discuss right now will be to highlight the importance of injuries and injury prevention globally, but especially here in the Middle East. I'm going to review the development of our program and some of the outcomes that we've been doing. I have no idea where those came from. Those were kind of nice to know. It's always fun when your computer decides to do something different. All right. So why do we talk about injuries? Why do we care about injuries? Let me ask you a question. How many people here have had a friend who's been significantly injured? How many people have had a family member who's been significantly injured? End up in the hospital. Okay? So you can see it's a common problem. And when you talk about WHO, there are three categories of problems they talk about: infectious disease, non-communicable diseases, and injuries. Now, one of the problems with injuries is historically, it's viewed as, there's a lot of fatalism, is what it's called. It's like, it was God's will. But we know that if we work hard, we can help make a difference. Through our action, our research, our thoughts, we can make a difference in terms of injuries. So for example, it's very clear that if you put a seatbelt on, it generally saves lives. Okay? So getting people to wear seatbelts makes a difference. So when they get into a car crash, which may happen for any reasons, they still will walk away from that car crash. If you look in the U.S. at car crashes and deaths from car crashes, over the last 10 to 12 years, there's been a significant decrease in the incidence of the mortality and morbidity from car crashes. That doesn't mean there's less car crashes. There's still a lot of car crashes, but they've made cars safer. They've learned how to do crumple zones and things like this, so they've made cars safer in case of a crash. But it's estimated that almost 6 million people lose their lives every year from intentional and unintentional injuries. And the problem is, the majority of those cases occur in lower and middle income countries. The vast majority of injuries, car crashes and other types of injuries occur in lower and middle income countries. Okay. And the other problem to recognize is there's also a certain amount of what we call, this is a social inequity issue, because if you're poor, then you're more likely to get injured and to have bad outcomes from injuries. Why is that? Well, first of all, if you live in Bangladesh and you're poor, you live in an area where it's likely to have hurricanes are going to come in, and your area that you live in is likely to be impacted. So perhaps it's where you live. If you're poor, you have to work at a job that might be more risky. You're working in a factory or a battery. So if you're poor, you may not be able to get the health care that you need because you can't afford it. So injuries in general, and a specific individual may be different, but in general, injuries there's a social and equity issue related to this. So the poor are more likely to be exposed, they have less access to the health care, and when someone gets injured, it may have substantial impact on their families. So if I'm the major breadwinner, I have some very, very graphic pictures. In Sudan, they've got grinders to grind meat and things like that. And they really should use pieces of wood or something to push the meat through, but sometimes they use their hands. And these aren't mechanical grinders. They figure out how to put a motor to them, so they're now electronic grinders. And they use their hands and the hand gets caught. Okay? And all of a sudden, they're the primary breadwinner. They're the primary person making money for that family, but they can't work because their hands all mangled. Okay? So that impacts not just them, but it impacts their family. Okay? So there's a number of different reasons why injuries impact everybody, but in particular low people without a lot of money. Okay? And statistics show that roughly almost over $5 billion in just road crashes every year. $500 billion. And in road traffic crashes cost most countries between 1% and 2% of the gross national product. Think if Egypt had an extra $1 billion or something like that. It'd be nice. This is an older picture, but I happen to like this one. This is from WHO from about 10, 12 years ago, looking at road traffic crashes, road traffic injuries. And if you take a look here, this is the Eastern Mediterranean region. This region here has some of the highest fatalities for road traffic accidents, road traffic crashes in the world. So it's a problem. In fact, I come from the U.S., and when I go to the U.S., they say, isn't it dangerous to go to Egypt in the Middle East? I said, the most dangerous thing I do here is cross the street. When I cross the street, I take my life ahead. But it's true. Injuries here are much more likely for that to happen than for something else. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about our program, our injury research training program in Egypt and the Middle East. I talked last hour about how to write a proposal. Okay? Now, I was very lucky early in my career. I somehow learned how to write proposals and I got funded quite a lot. It's been a little rougher lately, been busier, etc. But I wanted to write a proposal to teach. And I was going to write a proposal to teach people in the U.S. But as I was starting to get that ready, this wonderful opportunity to teach internationally came around from NIH. Now, I thought, oh great, even if I'm not successful, this is going to be a good opportunity to practice. So I wrote a proposal, and alhamdulillah, they liked it. So they gave us money, and they actually refunded it again. So we've been doing this now for about 10 years. And the grant was to establish research training programs that contribute to the capacity of developing country investigators and institutions to conduct human trauma and injury research relevant to the health needs of the developing country. So that's a fancy way of saying they want us to help you guys do research. But when I got to Egypt, they said, oh, that's great, but we need help taking care of patients. So I had two bosses. I had NIH that wanted me to do research, and I had the Ministry of Health and people here that wanted me to do clinical care. So I talked, I listened, I worked with my team, and we did both. We do both. Okay? And that's how we did it. So the main objectives are to develop research and training programs to help with capacity, to be able to conduct human trauma and injury research, develop and expand emergency and trauma care, and to emphasize the public health and clinical importance of emergency care within the health system. So I worked with my colleagues and we figured out a way where we could do both clinical training and research training. Okay. But yet again, why are we doing this? But this is a typical picture on Cairo streets, right? How many different hazards can you find in this picture? What about this guy? I was trying to cross the street. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to get across the street. Okay. I like this one. Let's just, But I'll tell you the one that bothers me the most. Okay, is this one. That little kid there in that seat with an open car gets into a car crash, that little kid will be devastated for life. Okay? This is why I did the work I did. So, as with any project, there are always challenges. I like to view challenges as opportunities, okay? So, I'm Hawaii. I mean, I'm from, I'm from the U.S. I don't know what I'm doing, but I've got good colleagues here, and I have to meet a lot of people. And I got to learn a little Arabic along the way. Shwaya. But I needed to develop relationships. Okay, I needed to meet people. We needed to work together. And one of the things I found in this process, working with the Ministry of Health, and nothing against the Ministry of Health, this is I think true of most governments, is that you get to meet somebody, you develop a relationship, and 6 months later they change the government, or they change the person, and so it's hard to have that long-term relationship. So universities are a little more stable when it comes to people, so we've worked and developed a relationship with universities. Okay. As we talked about, there's poor data collection and research infrastructure. There's financial limitations, including lack of leadership, societal instability. Now, these are not just challenges within Egypt, but this is where I work, so these are where I speak about. Okay. There's a belief that injuries can't be prevented, but we can prevent injuries. Okay. You can prevent injuries just in your life alone. Okay? Lack of leadership, and really lack of strategic direction. Okay? A lot of this is conversation, is communication, is working together so that you guys can figure out where we want to go. Okay? So, after conversations with my colleagues in the Ministry of Health and other people, we developed a couple of courses. We developed our short courses. We did 3 of them. So one of them was emergency preparedness and disaster response. And the second was our STEPS course, which is clinical care of trauma patients. And the third is our injury epidemiology course, which we're starting to work on making it an online course. And I thank the students who are here who are our first students on this so they can help us make it better. And then we developed a long-term training course, which was an intensive 2-month course in the U.S. to teach them how to do research and to really get them focused on research. But I'm going to talk a little bit about our STEPS course. That's really one of our most successful developments. So in 2006 we came here and they said to me, we want you to teach people how to take care of trauma patients. I said, well, great. There's courses out there. It turned out that those courses were either hard to get or too expensive. So we said, why don't we develop a course for Egypt and the region that we can control, that we can develop, we can adapt and change, so that in the end, it's going to meet the needs of the people here. So we developed our STEPS course, Sequential Trauma Education Programs. And we're training health professionals on all the basic and advanced aspects of trauma care. We include lectures, animal labs, we do multiple choice tests, objective structured clinical exams, and we developed a train-the-trainer program so that we were able to get them to teach people, so that it wasn't just people coming from outside to come and teach. So that was one of our short-term courses. Now, for our longer-term course, it's injury research training courses. Egypt, people come from the region. So we've had people from Sudan, from Iran, from Egypt. Excuse me. Come to the U.S. for 2 months, and the purpose of this course is to really teach them about injury epidemiology, injury research, and to get them to decide on a project that they're supposed to complete when they come back. So it's a lot of them use it so they can do their doctorate, their MD degree, because it gives them a chance to think through. And everything that we talked about last hour, we talked about a lot. So the last lecture, that was just an introduction. That was just to give you an idea, to give you kind of the broad picture. But each of those are details, and working through those details are very important. Okay? So where are we at this point? What are the results? Because in the end, they always want to say, well, what have you done? What have you given us? So in our short courses, primarily the STEPS course, we've trained about 900 people in the care of patients. We've trained people from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Oman, from Yemen, from Saudi Arabia, from Sudan, from Palestine, from Egypt. We've trained a lot of people. In our longer-term injury course, we've trained approximately 30 to 35 people. Many of them have come back and they have academic positions, or they're in the Ministry of Health, or the ones that are most recently trained are finishing up their master's or their doctorate degrees on the topics that we studied with them. We've had a number of folks who've done their either dissertations or published papers. So we looked at one study looking at the impact of morbidity and mortality in Cairo, Egypt. That was a doctorate degree. Young Egyptians' Perceptions, Attitudes, Knowledge of Injuries is a publication. This is one on occupational injuries, which was a publication as well. And then this one is a trainee from 2 years ago, looked at the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of family physicians and nurses regarding unintentional injuries among children. And that was submitted and revised and resubmitted, and we're trying to get the journal to make a decision so we can move forward. The STEPS course, or its equivalent, is now required by the Egyptian Board of Emergency Medicine. It's at Alexandria and Shams University, and it's in the process of being approved by the medical syndicate. So what have I learned through this whole process? What have we learned through this whole process? Well, I'll go back to what I said at the end of my last lecture. This is a team activity. We've got to work together, okay? You've got to be flexible, okay? Disasters happen. The power goes out, the computer doesn't work. You just have to learn to kind of adapt, okay?
Animals do not want to sleep in the animal lab. They run. Animals, they don't want to sleep in the animal lab.
So one of the stories we have, we end up with lots of really good stories. So we, for our animal lab, the STEPS course, we tried different animals. We tried goats, we tried dogs, we tried sheep. And now I wasn't there, so this is all secondhand, but my understanding is the sheep didn't do very well with the anesthesia. So they kept waking up and trying to jump off the table. That used to be a good animal lab when we do that. Identify key partners. Learn from each other. And I think it goes back to the question that I was asked at the end of last hour, is how do we do this? And I think for me, part of this is it has to be fun. I like what I do. I feel very fortunate to be able to come here, to talk to all of you, to work with my colleague, Dr. Mohammed. To me, this is fun. Okay? It means it's a lot of hard work. It means that there's a lot of things I need to do, but I've got to enjoy what I do, because otherwise it's hard to do. So in the end, our success is the success of many people. So folks at NIH, folks here in Egypt, University of Maryland, all the trainees, and many, many others. Okay. So this is just a quick introduction. I just want to show you what we've been working on for the last 10 years. Are we finished? We've got a long way to go. And you in the audience, you students, are part of what we're trying to help to move forward. So whether it's injuries, or whether it's some other research, or whether it's just taking care of your patients, we want you to do a good job. We want you to be passionate about what you do and committed to what you're doing. Because in the end, you're going to make a difference in terms of their lives and the lives of folks in Egypt. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I appreciate your attention. Now I'm going to take a moment. If you want to ask questions, go ahead. But I'm going to switch over to one other presentation because I want to talk a little bit about emergency medicine in the U.S. But if you have questions, please feel free to ask.
نعرف نتابع بس يعني انا موجود لما نخلص هذا
So for those of you here with Medical Research Organization, this is my last lecture for you guys. For those poor students that are that are part of our online course, they still have 2 more hours of me this afternoon.
Yes.
But for now, let me talk. So I spent a lot of time this morning trying to break my glasses. No, I spent a lot of time this morning talking about research, okay? One of the biggest challenges for me is to find the right balance between research and taking care of patients. I like taking care of people. It is something very satisfying when you help somebody on a one-to-one basis. Now, research and public health, those are populations. And I like it when I can make a difference on a population basis. But I also like it when I take care of patients on an individual basis. Okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the job that I do clinically and to give you an idea of what it's like to do emergency medicine in the U.S. Again, as I mentioned earlier, those are my disclosures. But I'm going to start off with a question for you. Why are we here right now? Why are we in this room talking about these topics?
Having fun.
Why are you in medical school? Someone speak up. I can't hear. Sorry, I've got old man's ear here. So go ahead.
New knowledge, idea for another research.
So I'm here to learn.
To help the patient more safely,
To help people, to save people.
save lives.
Save lives. What else? There are other reasons?
Share the vision.
Share the vision. That's a good one. I like that. We're here to talk about how we can help people. Okay? For those who go into medicine, there are a couple of things. First of all, medicine is a profession of giving. Okay? If you want to be selfish, you go to finance or something. I don't know. But we have to give to our patients. Okay? The other thing about medicine is that to be a good physician, a good nurse, to do this, you have to be a learner. You have to be a lifelong learner. Because let me say, if I stopped learning when I finished medical school, then a lot of what I know now, a lot of my knowledge would be old. And this is a joke, unfortunately. I'm not sure how true a joke it is. Medical school was right. Okay? And the bad news is I can't tell you which half. So we have to keep learning, because if we don't keep learning, we won't know what we do right and what we don't do right. That's what research is about. Okay? But for me, when someone comes to me in the emergency department, the key is they really need help. Sometimes people come to the emergency department because they have a minor injury, but they come in because most of the time they really need help. Okay? So from my vision, my perspective, there are three important things that I try to accomplish. The first is that I want to make sure that everyone has access to acute care. And I'll talk about acute care in a moment, how I define that. Okay? But people need to be, when they have a problem, it's fine to say, go to your regular doctor. Okay? If I've got high blood pressure, yeah, I don't want to go to the emergency department. I want to go see my regular doctor. But if I was in a car crash and injured my leg, if I'm having chest pain and a heart attack or something like that, I don't think that's the time to go to the regular doctor. That's the time you need the acute care you need. The second, and part of what the conversation here is that the care we deliver has to be of the highest quality. Okay? And what's the highest quality today may not be the same thing as the highest quality in 5 years. So we have to be learning and working together to make sure that we can deliver the best quality of care. We have the support for that, and that we're learning in the process. And the third component of this, which is often the challenge, is to make sure that there's adequate financial and structural support for the care we provide. So we have to be there at the table, talking to the presidents of our universities, or the heads of our hospitals, or the Minister of Health, or whoever, to make sure that they understand how important acute care is for our patients. Now, I recognize that everyone here is going to go into emergency medicine, or not everyone here is going to go into surgery, but regardless of the specialty, you still want to make sure you have support to be able to take care of your patients. So, what is acute care? So, the way I define acute care, we published this in the WHO Bulletin a couple years ago, is that really, we take care of folks that are time sensitive. So, they need short-term stabilization. They've got an emergency issue. They're having a heart attack. they've injured their ankle, but we don't know if it's a break or not. So it's not really an emergency, but it's an urgency. They may need acute trauma care. What's not on here, but I would include this, is obstetrical emergencies. Those, death from women. They need care now. They don't need care tomorrow. They need care now. So that, to me, it's a question of both the time sensitivity, nature, how time, and the fact that it's not something that can wait because it's too urgent. Okay. So, in terms of access to acute care, that's different in different places. We all face barriers. We have barriers in the U.S., you have barriers here. So you need to work on eliminating those barriers. And part of that is to be politically active and to work to make that acute care as a priority. And again, I go back to what I talked about in terms of injuries. Okay? In the last lecture, I talked about the impact globally. This is in the U.S. Okay? And you can't read this, I understand that, but this is the impact of injuries on the young. Every one of these are different age groups, okay? And every one of these circles is an injury-related problem. And these are the causes of death. So the number one cause of death for most of you, the folks in your age group, for most of you, are injuries, okay? The number fourth and fifth cause of death for most of you are injuries. Injuries are a major problem. And this is are the U.S. statistics. So we need to make sure that people have access to the care they need it when they need it. In the right time, in the right place, the right people. And as I said, we need to make sure that we have high quality research. So we want to make sure that what we deliver is the best in terms of both research and make sure that it's up to date and we have the best practices and best teachers. Now, I'm going to stop for a second and I'm going to show you a video. And the video is going to talk about emergency medicine in the U.S. And it's going to give you a nice perspective because in talking with my colleagues here, they say, well, we don't have the resources. Our areas. And I said, well, you know what? That's the way it was in the U.S. when we started. Now, we've been doing this for 45 or 50 years, so our resources, our abilities, we've worked hard to get them. But where you were, it wasn't that long ago for us. So give me a moment. See if I can get this set up. Try again. Is that better? I'm going to start over there. Great. work it is. The emergency department because they have a minor injury, but they come in because most of the time they really need help. Okay, so from my vision, my perspective, there are three important things that I try to accomplish. The first is that I want to make sure that everyone has access to acute care. And I'll talk about acute care in a moment, how I define that. Okay, but people need to be, when they have a problem, it's fine to say go to your regular doctor. Okay. If I've got high blood pressure, yeah, I don't want to go to the emergency department. I want to go see my regular doctor. But if I was in a car crash and injured my leg, if I'm having chest pain and a heart attack or something like that, I don't think that's the time to go to the regular doctor. That's the time you need the acute care you need. The second part of the conversation here is that the care we deliver has to be of the highest quality. Okay? And what's the highest quality today may not be the same thing as the highest quality in 5 years. So we have to be learning and working together to make sure that we can deliver the best quality of care. We have the support for that, and that we're learning in the process. And the third component of this, which is often the challenge, is to make sure there's adequate financial and structural support for the care we provide. So we have to be there at the table, talking to the presidents of our universities, or the heads of our hospitals, or the Minister of Health, or whoever, to make sure that they understand how important acute care is for our patients. Now, I recognize that everyone here is going to go into emergency medicine, or not everyone here is going to go into surgery, but regardless of the specialty, you still want to make sure you have support to be able to take care of your patients. So, what is acute care? So, the way I define acute care, and we published this in the WHO Bulletin a couple years ago, is that really we take care of folks that are time sensitive. So they need short-term stabilization. They've got an emergency issue. They're having a heart attack. They've injured their ankle, but we don't know if it's a break or not. So it's not really an emergency, but it's an urgency. They may need acute trauma care. What's not on here, but I would include this, is obstetrical emergencies. So, death from women. They need care now. They don't need care tomorrow, they need care now. So that, to me, is a question of both the time sensitivity, nature, how time, and the fact that it's not something that can wait because it's too urgent to follow. So, in terms of access to acute care, that's different in different places. We all face barriers. We have barriers in the US, you have barriers here. So you need to work on eliminating those barriers. And part of that is to be politically active and to work to make that acute care as a priority. And again, I go back to what I talked about in terms of injuries. Okay? In the last lecture, I talked about the impact globally. This is in the US. Okay? You can't read this, I understand that, but this is the impact of injuries on the young. Every one of these are different age groups, okay? And every one of these circles is an injury-related problem. And these are the causes of death. So the number one cause of death for most of you, in the folks in your age group, for most of you, are injuries, okay? The number fourth and fifth cause of death for most of you are injuries. Injuries are a major problem. And this is are the U.S. statistics. So we need to make sure that people have access to the care they need it when they need it. At the right time, the right place, the right people. And as I said, we need to make sure that we have high quality research. So we want to make sure that what we deliver is the best in terms of both research and make sure that it's up to date and we have the best practices, the best teachers. Now, I'm going to stop for a second and I'm going to show you a video. And the video is going to talk about emergency medicine in the U.S. And it's going to give you a nice perspective because in talking with my colleagues here, they say, well, we don't have the resources, our areas. And I said, well, you know what? That's the way it was in the U.S. when we started. Now, we've been doing this for 45 or 50 years, so our resources, our abilities, we've worked hard to get them. But where you were, it wasn't that long ago for us. So give me a moment. See if I get this set up. Better? Let's start here. Video that talks about the history is that where we started 60 years ago, single room, they would take the junior doctors and put them in the emergency department because it was the best place to learn. Of course, there was no supervision. There's no supervision. Turn it down, please. Thank you. There's no supervision. There was, you know, you were. The story of one of these people, one of the people, a very senior person now, was that when he was an intern, his father was 65. And his father died in the hospital because of heart failure. And his cardiologist wouldn't come to see him. He was being taken care of by an intern. And this guy was an intern, so he knew how little he knew. Okay? When I first came here, 7 years ago, I went out to another city and ended up going to the emergency department with a colleague. And the people there were overwhelmed. It was too many people, not enough supervision, a need to teach. And this is how it started in the US. But now we've got our organizations. We're now organized, we've got our professional groups. We've worked very hard to develop different groups. And one of the groups that we developed is called the American College of Emergency Physicians. And ACEP, the role of professional societies are a little different in the US. So the professional societies they're not like the medical syndicate. They don't give licenses. They're not like the government. They're really almost like our union, if you will. They're a group of professionals who work together. But over time, we've grown and we've become very important. The American Medical Association is an example of one for all doctors. ACEP, American College of Emergency Physicians, are just for emergency physicians. So we have an annual meeting, the Scientific Assembly, and we had, I think, 6,500 people there last time. There's 34,000 members of our organization now. So over time, we've grown. And our job is to promote the highest quality of emergency care and be the leading advocate for emergency physicians, their patients, and the public. And why is this important? Because healthcare is changing. The one thing I can tell you that is always constant is change. So we have to be part of the change, otherwise we're going to get rolled over or become not important. And ACEP has been there and continues to be involved in the shaping of emergency medicine. We're there for healthcare reform. We write to and talk to our politicians. We work to make sure there's enough educational opportunities for our trainees and our medical students. Because I know as a medical student you don't realize it, but there are struggles and fights to make sure there's enough students, that there's enough education, and that who does the teaching. Those are all things that happen as part of medical education. Okay? One of the things that we developed is the ACEP report card. And so what we did is we took about 135 different measures that were publicly available, and we looked at each state to see how well they were doing to support emergency medicine. Okay? And so we could say that this state did a C, or this state did an A. We can take a look at that, and then we can say, go to the politicians and say, look, I don't know about you, but I don't think that a D+ is a great grade in access to care. And what works really well, we found out, is that if we go there and their neighborhood states got a little bit better, so it's always like, well, my neighbor did better than I am. So if one state gets a B and another state gets a C, then the state says, why? Hey, why do we get a C? What do we have to do to change that? So that's part of advocating. That's part of learning how to be effective. But we worked on this to make sure we had a good tool that was scientifically based and able to be used in terms of advocacy. So just to finish up, in terms of advocacy, it's about relationships. One of the things I learned coming to Egypt, I don't know learned, but really reinforced, it's about relationships. So the people you meet here now in medical school, people you'll be working with and seeing off and on throughout your careers. So we'll learn to work together. It really helps, okay? You need to be at the table and you need to be a leader. So in the end, you need to be vocal, but you need to be vocal in a professional way. You can't just, yell and scream. You have to sit there. You have to be able to advocate. You have to talk to people, okay? Because in the end, we want to assure that access to acute care is for everybody, regardless of their ability to pay. That we can deliver the highest quality of acute care possible, and there's adequate support for what we do. Because, to be honest, I feel very lucky because I feel I've chosen the best job there is, taking care of people. Okay? And in the end, and I think what I want to end all my talks with here today in this group, is that you have to be passionate. You have to be committed. This is your career. This is what you're doing. But what you're doing helps other people. So you want to be passionate. Okay? It's your drive, it's your commitment, it's your leadership, it's your advocacy. It's what you do that makes a difference. So I know that you guys thank me and clap, but I have to tell you, I thank you for coming and for listening. And inshallah, you will make a difference in the lives of your patients and for Egypt. So thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, please. Are you asking what's necessary here in Egypt or what's necessary in the U.S.? In the U.S. Go ahead. Do you have a couple hours we can talk about it? The requirements to become a resident in the U.S. are very complicated to do medical, but you have to do the TOEFL, you have to do USMLEs, you have to do a number of different exams. And then once you've done all that, you then go through a process of finding a residency program. Now, emergency medicine is relatively competitive because people like to go into it. So we'll look at all those things and interview people, and then we decide who we want, and they decide where they want to go. So it's a long process. But the process of getting into the health system in the U.S. is a high hurdle.
That's why I'm asking, the use of your talk on that. For any residency, I'm asking about emergency medicine because it's very competitive. I'm asking why you as Dr. Mark would choose someone who had the same exam, the same scores massage, but you will choose this one and this doctor first. That will be further.
That's a very, again, why do you get chosen from one place versus another? And everyone, even if you have the same scores, you're not the same people. So there are a couple things. First of all, how well have you performed up to now? So I'll go with what I said before, which is excel, do the best you can now, so that when you get to that point, you have a better position to be able to be accepted. Second, when you go there to be interviewed, be there. Be positive, be passionate, be committed, be interested. Now, if I want to find a new job, okay, at the level I'm at, I can apply for different jobs. But if I really want a job, I do my research. I'll look at I'll go online and say, what are they looking for? Who are the people they work with? Who do I know? All those things go into it, okay? So, but the first is, do well now. Because they're going to say, well, great, you only scored this on you only did this well. You want to make sure that you excel. And then the last thing I would do is to do something different or unique. What makes you special? Why would I want you in my program? What makes you special? Well, I published 3 papers. I started a group that dealt with the poor. I did something meaningful. And I get a lot of you got a lot of satisfaction out of whatever that activity was, but at the same time it shows an accomplishment. That you're more than just simply go to school, go to classes, go home. Okay. So that's what I would say. Those are, to me, in a way, I'm going to take it away from what do you need to be successful in the U.S. emergency medicine residency, and what do you need to be successful here in Egypt. Now, it helps, it's always nice a little wasta goes a long way, I know, but it helps to know people and stuff like that. But in the end, a lot of it is how well you perform. And you learn and you meet people as you go along, so you develop your relationships as you do. Other questions? It's a great question. Difficult, but very good question. Ira? So, I would say the question is, we don't have emergency medicine here in Egypt, okay? And what does it take to create emergency medicine? And the answer is, you actually do have emergency medicine here in Egypt. There's 5 different institutions: Alexandria, Suez Canal, Tanta, Mansour, and one other which I always forget. But so there are places where you can get masters in emergency medicine. Okay? So part of it is there is the growth. And the second is there are activities online that you can look at, and you can look to learn about the topic. But in the end, if that's what you want to do, then you work. The people that started in the U.S. 50 or 60 years ago, the story. When I went to medical school, and I was trying to decide where I wanted to go in my specialty, I decided I was going to do emergency medicine. And I had a friend of mine whose father had been an obstetrician for many, many, many years. He was a good friend. So we were talking, and when I told his father that I was going to do emergency medicine, his face dropped. He's like, emergency medicine, that's where people who didn't have a practice went. That's where people who couldn't do any other job went. And as a friend of mine likes to say, we took everyone's leftovers and we made lunch out of it. But we made a gourmet lunch. We decided this was our specialty and we were going to do something with it. And that's what you do. If you want to do emergency medicine, then you work with your colleagues to develop it and you decide. But there are places here where you can do a master's in emergency medicine, and at least one place with a doctorate. I think Alexandria has a doctorate as well. Yes?
How can we join these courses?
How do you join this process? The courses. We give them periodically. The best thing to do is to make sure you're in connection with Dr. With Dr. Mohammed and others. They can tell you when we do the courses. We have not been, I'll be very honest, we're not been as good about advertising the courses. But I would say if you're involved in the Ain Shams Medical Student Research Group, that's one way to do it. And if you're at another university, talk with your colleagues at Ain Shams so that you can start your own research group at your university. So it's through talking with each other and working together, whether it's at Tanta or Cairo or Ain Shams, that's how you're going to make a difference. Good questions. One more? Yes.
You mentioned that the course stays for 6 weeks in the US.
6 to 8.
6 to 8 weeks. And following that, there is a research work that's supposed to be done in the home country.
Correct.
Right? And this is probably part of the master's degree or PhD that's going on in the home country.
Right.
Is it possible for people who completed the courses, this is the question, to continue as a joint degree, as a master in emergency through University of Maryland or any other, and conduct the practical part in the home country? So by the end of the day, they will have a co-certified master program.
So the question is that in terms of, we have people that come to the U.S. for our 6 to 8 week course. and whether or not we can turn that into a formal educational degree at University of Maryland. The answer is yes, but you have to go through all the requirements to get into the program at University of Maryland and take additional courses there. So it's not, you can't just jointly certify it. They have to go through the full process of being accepted, so that they'd have to do a formal TOEFL, they may have to do other exams, they'd have to take courses there, and we can work through all those details. The answer is yes, but it'd be complicated, and the barrier levels are high.
This is a clinical, so we should go to the USMLE and residency training, or it's an academic?
It's academic. It's academic. It's not clinical. In fact, we don't. The educational structure in the U.S. is different. So there's not a master's of emergency medicine. It will most likely be a master's of scientific investigation or a master's of public health, because we don't do the educational process. A whole separate conversation is different in the U.S. Okay, shukran. Thank you again for your attention.
So much, and
I would like to thank our delegate professors, and for the injury epidemiology group, we'll start in our small group, and the others, thank you so much, and hope we'll see you soon. Thank you.